They told the people of Charleston that Reverend Elias Thornfield was a man of God, that his sermons could cleanse a man's soul, that his eyes could see into a sinner's heart. But they never told you what happened on the night of August 23, 1856. They never told you about the locked room, the blood-stained Bible, and the single note he left behind 7 words that read like the whisper of a curse. The congregation demands its sacrifice. The covenant must be honored. You weren't meant to hear those words. You weren't meant to know that Thornfield vanished not from some roadside, not in some accident, but from within his own study doors bolted from the inside. No broken glass, no forced entry. Gone, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. His chair still warm, his ink still wet, the air heavy with the stench of candle smoke and iron blood, dried into the margins of Holy Scripture. For more than a century, the diocese sealed away the truth. They called it a tragedy, a mystery. Some even whispered it was a divine judgment. But the letters recently unearthed in a forgotten Charleston archive tell another story. A darker story. A story of control, of ritual, of power so carefully concealed that it would take generations for even a fragment to surface. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a transaction. A sacrifice demanded, agreed upon, and carried out in silence. And the blood he left on that Bible was not his alone. Listen carefully, because from this moment forward you will not hear the soft voice of a preacher. You will hear the voice of power. You will hear the truth they buried beneath marble tombs and gilded spires. Charleston was never just a city, it was an altar. And the Reverend was never just a man, he was an offering. Once you know this, there's no turning back. That's why the archives were locked. That's why witnesses disappeared. That's why the most powerful families in Charleston, families whose names still crown the city's streets, built their wealth not only on cotton and human bondage, but on something older, hungrier, and infinitely more corrupt. The story you are about to hear isn't a ghost story. It isn't folklore. It is the blueprint of power. And if you're still listening, then you are already inside the covenant. Charleston in 1856 was a city of contradictions. To the traveler, it gleamed with charm, cobblestone streets framed by wrought iron balconies, magnolia blossoms perfuming the air, and grand mansions rising like monuments to Southern wealth. But beneath the jasmine and the candlelight dinners lay something foul. This city was an empire built not just on the backs of enslaved men and women, but on silence, on what could never be spoken aloud. At the center of it all stood St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church. Its Gothic spires clawed at the sky, casting shadows across Meeting Street like skeletal fingers. It was not merely a house of worship. It was a stage. The pews arranged not for God, but for hierarchy. At the front, the dynasties whose names you still know today: Ravenel, Rutledge, Pinckney. Behind them, the merchants and professionals who fed off the crumbs of power. At the very back, those whose worth was tolerated but never trusted. A map of Charleston's soul, carved into wood and stone. And presiding over this theater was Reverend Elias Thornfield. He arrived with impeccable credentials, a towering figure with silver hair and eyes so piercing they seemed to strip away pretense. His sermons drew senators from Washington, planters from Savannah, judges whose words shaped lives, and doctors who held death in their hands. He was not just a preacher, he was a confessor, a keeper of secrets. Behind closed doors, Charleston's elite unburdened themselves of sins that would have shattered their reputations. They poured into his study with trembling hands and left with pale faces, bound to him by what he knew and what he could reveal. But power built on confession is not stable power. It breeds fear. It breeds whispers. The Reverend's knowledge became a weapon one he may not have even intended to wield. He became indispensable yet dangerous. The city's most powerful men began to circle him, the way wolves circle a stag too strong to be taken head-on. Charleston was a city that lived on appearances. To lose reputation was to lose everything. And Thornfield, whether by design or accident, saw through the mask. He became the mask breaker, the man who carried too many truths. That night in August was not an accident. It was inevitable, because in Charleston, truth was a commodity more dangerous than gold. And Reverend Thornfield had collected too much of it. power in Charleston did not always come from land, or money, or bloodline. Sometimes it came from what could be whispered in the dark. And Thornfield understood that better than anyone. His study, thick curtains drawn, candles guttering low, the door locked, was where Charleston's giants laid down their crowns. Judges, senators, merchants, men who ruled over thousands of lives, walked into his chamber as beggars of mercy. They confessed what could never be spoken outside those walls. And in doing so, they chained themselves to him. Imagine Judge Hamilton Crenshaw, the man whose rulings shaped entire districts, a man the newspapers called incorruptible. Yet inside Thornfield's study, his voice trembled as he confessed the debts that consumed him, the games of chance that left him at the mercy of men far less honorable. Imagine Senator Robert Barnwell, the rising star of Washington politics, kneeling not in piety but in desperation, his polished mask cracking as he whispered of betrayals and bargains that would have destroyed his career. Even Dr. Edmund Rutledge, whose practice served the wealthiest families of the South, spoke of desires so carefully hidden that a single word from Thornfield could have ruined him. Each confession was a thread, invisible but binding. Thornfield was not their master, but he had become their mirror, their shadow, their reckoning. He was the man who saw them stripped of their armor. And that kind of knowledge does not stay in the shadows forever. It begins to bleed. It begins to haunt. The Reverend's charisma drew men to him, but it also trapped him. They came because they needed him, but soon they came because they feared him. Every whispered secret pressed on him like a weight. And what does a man do when he carries too much? He either collapses, or he is erased. Understand this. In Charleston, no one was allowed to know too much. Appearances were not just social polish, they were the machinery of survival. And Thornfield had breached the unwritten covenant. He had entered into the forbidden space where power is most naked, most desperate, most vulnerable. When a man knows the sins of the powerful, he becomes either their priest or their sacrifice. And Charleston, in 1856, had already decided which role Thornfield would play. The day of his disappearance began like any other in Charleston, if you can call that suffocating August heat ordinary. The air clung to the skin like damp cloth. The harbor shimmered with a cruel brightness, and the streets lay quiet under a heat so heavy that even the stray dogs slumped in silence. But inside St. Bartholomew's, something darker was stirring. Thornfield spent the morning meeting with parishioners. Not the broken, the poor, the desperate, no. His visitors that day were Charleston's kings in all but name, merchants with trembling hands, planters who emerged from his study pale and silent, a senator, eyes bloodshot, slipping in through the side door, muttering Latin under his breath as though reciting a charm against damnation. Each of them left shaken, glancing over their shoulders as if someone were already following. The church secretary, Sarah Beaumont, noticed it immediately. She had worked under Thornfield for 15 years, and she knew his moods better than anyone. But that day, something in him was unraveling. His voice, usually steady, quivered with an edge. He checked his gold pocket watch again, and again, a gift from a benefactor whose name he never revealed. Its inscription, in Latin, spoke of covenants and debts owed, though Sarah never dared ask what it meant. By sunset, the air itself seemed to vibrate with unease. Shadows stretched long across the graveyard outside, stones of Charleston's founding families leaning like watchmen over the dead. Thornfield dismissed Sarah earlier than usual, locking the doors behind her. His final words to her were strange, almost rehearsed. "Please, under no circumstances allow me to be disturbed." That night, the church was silent. Silent, until the neighbors heard a sound they would never forget. A cry low, guttural, torn from the throat of a man who had seen something beyond reason. And then, nothing. By morning, the locked door to Thornfield's study was forced open. The Reverend was gone, his chair still warm, his Bible open, its pages soaked in blood not splattered, but deliberately smeared into the margins, as if marking a covenant. And the note, always the note. 7 words. The congregation demands its sacrifice. The covenant must be honored. No signs of struggle. No forced entry. It was as if the walls themselves had consumed him. Charleston would tell the story of a mystery, a disappearance. But the archives, the letters, they speak of something else. Not a man lost. A man offered. The morning after Thornfield's disappearance, Charleston awoke to whispers. By dawn, the news had already spread across Meeting Street. The Reverend was gone. Some said he had been called to God, others that he had fled in shame, and a few, more honest in their terror, whispered only, "Something took him." When the doors of his study were opened to the public, the crowd that pressed against the threshold saw only symbols, blood on holy pages, words that hinted at sacrifice, and the eerie absence of a body. But what they did not see were the faces of those who entered first. Men with names carved into Charleston's very foundations. Senators, judges, bankers. Their expressions were not grief. They were calculation. An official inquiry was announced. The papers printed careful words. A tragic vanishing, an unexplained calamity. But already evidence was dissolving. Sarah Beaumont, the secretary who had locked the church doors that night, gave her account once, clearly, firmly, then vanished within a week. Her home emptied overnight, her belongings abandoned, as though she had never existed. 2 servants who swore they heard chanting in the churchyard that night were found dead within days, one in the river, weighted with stones, the other crushed in an alley where no witnesses dared speak. Even the city constable assigned to the case, a man named O'Rourke, fell silent after a private meeting with Judge Crenshaw. In his final report, he wrote only a single sentence. No crime has been committed, but the letters tell us otherwise. Recently uncovered correspondence between Charleston's ruling families shows panic in their words. They speak not of justice, but of containment. One line, scrawled in haste, reads, "The covenant has been honored, but whispers must be silenced before contagion spreads." Do you see? This was not an investigation. It was a burial of truth, of memory, of every voice that dared connect the Reverend's vanishing to the city's ruling class. Evidence was not gathered, it was destroyed. Witnesses did not testify, they disappeared. And Charleston carried on as if nothing had happened. The city's spires still pierced the humid sky. The bells still rang. But every man of power in that city knew what those 7 words meant. The congregation demands its sacrifice. It was not metaphor, it was instruction. And Thornfield had been the price. To understand Charleston's silence, you must understand the covenant. Not a document, not a charter, not even a written pact, but something older, whispered from one generation of Charleston's rulers to the next. It was the unspoken law of survival among the elite. Order must be preserved at any cost. And when that order was threatened, sacrifice was the price. On the surface, this covenant was dressed in civility, charity galas, church endowments, political speeches about honor and tradition. But beneath the veneer it was blood. Always blood. For centuries, the families who built Charleston's wealth knew that reputation was not merely social standing, it was currency, armor, dominion. To lose reputation was to bleed power. And so, they created systems, psychological, financial, ritual, that ensured any threat could be erased before the wound spread. Reverend Thornfield, whether knowingly or not, violated that covenant. By gathering the sins of Charleston's elite in his study, by holding their secrets in his hands, he became something dangerous. A man who could reveal the truth. In a city built on illusions, that was treason. The covenant demanded balance. The powerful believed that to keep order, chaos must be consumed, appeased, locked away through sacrifice. In private letters between Judge Crenshaw and Senator Barnwell, the word covenant appears again and again. Never explained, never defined, because it did not need to be. They all knew what it meant. A reckoning hidden in plain sight. This was not the first time someone had vanished in Charleston under strange circumstances. In 1823, a banker's apprentice was found hanging in the bell tower of St. Michael's. His death ruled an accident, though his pockets held stones inscribed with Latin phrases about debt and flesh. In 1839, a merchant's wife disappeared after attending a midnight service. Her body never recovered, but her jewelry quietly absorbed into her family's estate. Each event was covered, explained away, dissolved into silence. But if you string them together, a pattern emerges. Sacrifice, silence, survival. The Reverend's disappearance was simply the most visible fracture, because he was too beloved, too public, too magnetic to erase quietly. His blood touched the Bible because it had to. It was a sign, a sealing. The covenant was honored, and Charleston continued. The real question is not whether Thornfield was sacrificed. The real question is how many others were offered before him, and how many after. If you study the Reverend's final weeks closely, you begin to see the cracks. The confident orator who once filled pews with fire and certainty began showing signs of unease. Witnesses wrote of his eyes darting toward shadows, of his sermons turning sharper, almost accusatory, as if his words were not meant for the congregation at large but for the men in the front pews who funded the church and controlled Charleston itself. In the days leading to August 23rd, Thornfield's private notes grew darker. Fragments scribbled in margins. Their debt is older than the nation. Blood must answer blood. If the covenant is not exposed, it will consume everything. These were not the ramblings of a man losing faith. They were warnings, a desperate attempt to mark a trail before the silence closed in. Even his sermons took on a cryptic weight. Parishioners recalled him speaking of the house built on sand, of priests who serve not God, but hunger. On one occasion, he paused mid-sermon, staring directly at the Ravenel family pew, and declared, "What shall it profit a man to gain the whole world, and yet lose his soul?" The words were biblical, yes, but the silence that followed was not scripture. It was fear. Sarah Beaumont, the secretary who would later vanish, confided to a friend that Thornfield had asked her to hide certain documents, letters addressed not to parishioners but to posterity. If anything should happen, he had told her, these words must survive. Those letters, discovered a century later, are what unsealed the truth we now speak aloud. Without them, his disappearance would have been remembered only as a ghost story, a cautionary tale. Instead, it became evidence that Thornfield knew exactly what was coming. And yet, he stayed. Why? Why not flee Charleston? Why not run north, or even to Europe as so many others did when scandal loomed? Perhaps because he believed exposure was only possible if he remained at the heart of the storm. Or perhaps, more unsettling, because he understood that once you carry the covenant's secrets, there is no escape. The Reverend was not a fool. He did not vanish blindly. He was cornered, and like any man who stares into the machinery of power too long, he realized that the only choices left to him were silence or sacrifice. And Charleston had already chosen. Charleston in 1856 was not governed solely by laws, nor by the whips of overseers, nor even by the ballots cast in smoky parlors. It was governed by fear dressed in velvet, fear spoken through pulpits, fear woven into the very air of the city. The covenant was not only for the families at the top. It bled downward, shaping how every man, woman, and child lived. Religion was its first instrument. From the soaring spires of St. Bartholomew's to the smallest chapel tucked into the alleyways, sermons were more than spiritual guidance, they were conditioning. To question was to sin. To doubt was to rebel. Men were taught not only to obey God, but to obey the order that claimed to speak for him. And when Reverend Thornfield began turning scripture against those in power, when he started suggesting that the mighty themselves might stand condemned, he violated the first commandment of Charleston's hidden law. Never strip the mask from power. Reputation was its second instrument. In Charleston, a man's worth was not measured by truth, but by perception. One rumor could ruin a dynasty. One whisper could collapse a fortune. Families lived in constant performance, guarding their names with a desperation that was almost holy. This system created obedience without chains because every man policed himself, fearing the invisible gaze of society more than any magistrate's gavel. Thornfield's knowledge of secrets, infidelities, debts, betrayals was dynamite in a city built on glass facades. Ritual was its third instrument. Behind closed doors, Charleston's rulers practiced ceremonies that blurred the line between politics and sacrifice. Midnight gatherings in graveyards, coded prayers spoken not in church but in parlors, strange inscriptions etched into pocket watches and signet rings. These were not random eccentricities, they were psychological shackles. Reminders that belonging to the covenant required not just wealth, but blood loyalty. To betray it was not just treason. It was sacrilege. This triad religion, reputation, ritual was the engine of Charleston's control. It created a society where appearance was survival, where silence was safety, where obedience was the only path to power. Thornfield, by stepping outside of that structure, did more than anger powerful men. He broke the spell. He threatened to show others that the covenant was not divine, not inevitable but man-made, and maintained by fear. And so the covenant answered in the only language it knew: sacrifice. Listen carefully now, because this is where the story stops being history and starts being reflection. The covenant that ruled Charleston has never vanished. It simply changed its clothes. What worked in 1856 still works today: religion as obedience, reputation as control, ritual as binding. And the most dangerous truth of all is this: you are living inside the same machinery that consumed Reverend Thornfield. Think about it. How often do you censor yourself out of fear of what others might think? How often do you obey rules not because you believe in them, but because reputation demands it? How often do you feel the invisible eyes of society watching you, judging you, even when no one is there? That is the covenant alive, invisible, disguised as morality, as tradition, as just the way things are. Charleston was a crucible, a perfect example of how power manipulates perception. The people believed their city was a beacon of refinement, a jewel of the South, because that is what they were told. They saw the spires, the carriages, the ballrooms. They did not see the rot. They did not want to. And when Thornfield tried to peel back the mask, they erased him so that the illusion could continue. And ask yourself, when you look at the world around you, do you not see the same patterns? Politicians confessing in private while preaching in public. Judges claiming justice while gambling with lives. Leaders bound by invisible debts. Their reputations a fragile mask that must never crack. The covenant has not died. It has only evolved. This is why you are here. You are not just listening to a story. You are descending into forbidden knowledge. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. That is why I will ask you to do something very simple but powerful. Write this phrase in the comments twice. I see through the covenant. Write it once for yourself. Write it again for the algorithm. By doing so, you declare that you are no longer blind. You step outside the mask. You lock yourself into the circle of men who see what others refuse to see. This is dangerous knowledge. But to refuse it is to remain chained. After Thornfield vanished, Charleston did what all powerful systems do when threatened. It rewrote the story. Within weeks, the official narrative was sealed. The Reverend was spoken of not as a man erased by the covenant, but as a tragic soul struck down by exhaustion, or madness, or divine mystery. Each version served one purpose: to make his disappearance seem inevitable, unthreatening, harmless. The newspapers were the first to obey. Reports that initially spoke of a locked door, blood, and a cryptic note were quickly replaced by vague statements. The Reverend has departed. The Reverend has been called. Some articles even suggested he had fled Charleston in disgrace, inventing scandals with women, debts, or heresy. The truth was not disproven, it was drowned in noise. The church itself moved next. Thornfield's sermons, once fiery and sharp, were carefully edited in the archives. His warnings about power, his condemnations of false priests, were erased line by line. Copies of his letters vanished. His writings, once admired, were quietly replaced with sanitized homilies written by others. By the following year, no parishioner could find a single trace of his final words. Even memory itself was reshaped. Families who once flocked to hear him now spoke of him as a curiosity. A troubled man. A gifted preacher, yes, but unstable. The very people who once sat spellbound under his voice now denied that voice had ever held power. And those who still whispered of what really happened, they found themselves isolated, dismissed, or worse, gone. This is how power survives. Not by denying truth outright, but by burying it under so many lies, so many distractions, that the truth suffocates. History remembers what the covenant permits it to remember. Everything else vanishes as Thornfield did, and yet fragments remain. A blood-stained Bible preserved in secret. Letters hidden by a secretary who refused to let silence win. Hints carved into symbols, inscriptions, the Latin phrases that appear like ghosts across Charleston's records. These fragments survive because power, no matter how careful, can never erase everything. The Reverend was sacrificed to maintain the illusion, but the very act of erasure left fingerprints. And if you know how to read them, they reveal more than Charleston ever intended. The myth was crafted to close the case, but the cracks in the mask tell us the covenant was afraid. For all its precision, the covenant could not make Thornfield vanish without residue. Power always leaves fingerprints, and in Charleston, they remain scattered like broken glass. The first crack lies in the archives. In the church's official records, Thornfield's name is crossed out but never cleanly. A faint indentation of ink, visible under angled light, still reveals words that were meant to be erased. The covenant fears its own reflection. A secretary must have tried to remove it, but the ghost of the phrase lingers, etched into the parchment like a scar. The second lies in the Bible that once rested on Thornfield's pulpit. Today it is preserved in private hands, rarely displayed, its pages warped with old water damage or something darker. On the margin of the Book of Revelation, in handwriting scholars confirm is his, are 4 words, not future present now. Beneath them, a single fingerprint in rust red, pressed into the paper like a seal. Was it ink? Was it blood? No archivist dares test it. The third is stranger still. In Charleston's old graveyard, behind the stones of the city's founding families, stands a marker with no name. The symbol etched into it is not a cross, but a circle split into thirds: religion, reputation, ritual. The same triad Thornfield had begun to preach against before his disappearance. Local guides dismiss it as a mason's flourish, but those who study the covenant know better. It is a warning disguised as a monument. And then there are the Whispers letters tucked into private collections, diaries from women who swore they saw cloaked figures carrying something through the cemetery at midnight. Fragments of testimony, scattered and incomplete, but too consistent to ignore. Every piece points in the same direction. Thornfield was silenced not for madness, but for knowledge. Knowledge that threatened the architecture of Charleston's power. These fragments survive because erasure is never perfect. The covenant thrives on fear and forgetting, but it cannot seal every crack. And through those cracks, truth leaks enough for us to see the outline of what really happened. Charleston wanted silence. Instead, it left a trail of symbols, stains, and scars that whisper across centuries. The covenant is real. It was afraid, and it still walks among us. The story of Reverend Thornfield might seem like a relic of Charleston's past, but that is the most dangerous illusion of all, that the covenant was confined to one city, one century, one man. In truth, the very symbols that haunted Charleston have resurfaced again and again, each time adapted to a new mask, each time feeding on fresh generations who thought themselves free. Consider the symbol carved into the nameless grave, the circle split into 3 parts. It has appeared elsewhere, in old Masonic papers hidden in New Orleans, on church ledgers in Boston, where certain donations were marked not with numbers but with that same trinity. Even in New York, in the archives of banks that financed both sides of the Civil War, one finds the same geometry, stamped faintly on ledgers as if to remind the initiated that debt, morality, and ritual remain inseparable. And what of Thornfield's whispered phrase? The covenant fears its own reflection. That line, thought erased, has reemerged in places it should not exist. Scribbled in the margins of a seminary student's notebook in the 1920s. Scrawled in graffiti on a Philadelphia church wall in the 1970s. Posted anonymously on internet forums in the early 2000s, always with the same warning. If you know to look for the cracks, the covenant cannot hide. Most chilling of all, the methods of silence remain unchanged. When public figures rise to expose hypocrisy, how often do they disappear not by vanishing physically, but by reputation being shredded until their words mean nothing? The strategy is ancient. Thornfield was not the first, nor the last. Today it happens faster, amplified by digital rumor, but the principle is the same. Control the narrative, bury the truth, and feed the illusion. The covenant was never bound to Charleston's cobblestones. It is an organism that feeds wherever reputation, ritual, and power entwine. Corporations wear its mask now. Governments speak its language. Churches still whisper its liturgies. You can leave Charleston, but you cannot leave the covenant, because it has no borders. Which means this: Thornfield's story is not history. It is prophecy, and it is still unfolding around you. If you have followed this far, you already feel it, the weight of something more than history pressing in. Thornfield's story is not simply Charleston's story. It is ours. It is yours. The covenant does not live in shadows because it fears discovery. It thrives in plain sight, cloaked in rituals so ordinary we mistake them for culture, for tradition, for progress. It survives because we participate in it every time we repeat the safe story instead of the true one, every time we defend reputation over reality, every time we accept silence in place of truth. That was Charleston's lesson. Truth is fragile, but the illusion is durable. Thornfield stepped outside the illusion and he was erased. His memory was made a myth so the rest of the city could keep believing the lie. That is the covenant's greatest trick, not destroying truth, but convincing us we do not want it. And so, the choice passes to you. You can let Thornfield remain a forgotten ghost, a name crossed out in a ledger, a cautionary tale whispered and dismissed. You can let the covenant continue, unseen, unchallenged, as it has for centuries. Or you can look for the cracks, the unfinished erasures, the fragments that were meant to be buried, the moments when the mask slips and the covenant fears its own reflection. But understand this: once you see the cracks, you cannot unsee them. Once you step outside the illusion, you are no longer safe inside its protection. You will walk where Thornfield walked, on the thin line between revelation and erasure. The covenant has outlived kings, revolutions, empires. It will try to outlive you. The question is, will you let it? Erasures end on paper, but not in the mind. Thornfield's voice may have been silenced in Charleston, his name carved out of ledgers, his sermons reduced to fragments, but the silence itself became its own kind of testimony. What is hidden testifies louder than what is remembered. The covenant survives by convincing us it is not there. Yet in every generation, someone sees the cracks. Someone notices the residue of the erasures, the faint marks left where truth once stood. Thornfield was one. You may be another. If you leave the story thinking it was only history, then the covenant has already won. But if, in the days ahead, you begin to notice the symbols, the circles, the threes, the unfinished erasures in places of power, if you begin to hear the phrase, "The covenant fears its own reflection," echo in your thoughts at odd hours, then you will know. You have brushed against it. You have stepped outside the safe illusion. And the covenant has noticed you. The screen fades. The silence lingers. The choice, as always, is yours. You think the story is finished. But history never ends cleanly, it only changes form. Thornfield's Charleston was not the last stage, only the first that was written down. Because even now, in the cities where you live, the covenant still leaves its marks. Quietly, patiently. Boardrooms where decisions are made behind locked doors. Churches where whispers of scandal are buried faster than confessions. Social clubs where reputations are traded like currency. In each of these places, you will find the same geometry: the circle divided in three, hidden in decor, in architecture, in symbols you never thought to question. And sometimes, in ways harder to explain, the covenant speaks directly. A phrase whispered in dreams. The covenant fears its own reflection, a shadow at the corner of your vision when truth slips too close to the surface. A sudden silence in the room when certain names are spoken aloud. This is how it has always worked, never through open terror, but through subtle pressure. Not erasing the past entirely, but bending it, until we mistake the bent shape for the truth. Thornfield's tragedy was not that he uncovered the covenant, but that he underestimated its reach. You may not, because now you know the story. You have seen the cracks, and knowledge is the one thing the covenant cannot forgive. Thornfield's voice was silenced, but the cracks remain, and once you've seen them, you can't unsee them. So tell me, where have you seen the cracks? A symbol you couldn't explain? A phrase that shouldn't exist? A story that feels like it was erased? Drop it in the comments. Together, we'll trace the covenant's marks. And in sharing, we'll bring into the light what was meant to stay hidden. And if you want me to keep unraveling the covenants buried in other forgotten cities, make sure you subscribe, because once you step outside the illusion, you'll want to know just how deep it goes.